Hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and welcome to Perspectives Matter. You know, the study of philosophy goes back many centuries, and yet I would bet that we often have trouble defining what it means and its importance in our lives. You know, we did a program years ago entitled Philosophy, Who Needs It? And the consensus was that we all do, yet we could all be more aware of its importance. On today's program, our guests will provide you with unique perspectives on an old philosophy, Stoicism, and a relatively new one, Objectivism. We'll examine the role of reason in a good life. We'll focus on the things that we can actually control, and we'll take a look at different perspectives on an individual's role and society. Now, to assist us in this endeavor is Daniel Richards. He's a recognized expert in marketing ideas that advance liberty. He currently serves as executive director of the Prometheus Foundation, where he leads efforts to promote objectivism and foster a culture of rational thought and individual responsibility. And joining Daniel is Stephen Kent. He's a media trainer, public speaking coach, political commentator, creator of the Geeky Stoics YouTube channel, where his mission is to help people find practical wisdom, life advice, and community through the stories that they love. Now, I'm going to start with you, Stephen. I know there's at least one person watching this program who is saying Stoicism. So tell us what Stoics are and what Stoicism is, easier for me to say, and then give us an idea what Geeky Stoics means.
Sure. So Stoicism in a nutshell is the belief that we don't control the things that happen to us. We only control how we respond. It is a philosophy that grew out of ancient Greece. A guy by the name of Zeno of Citium is the founder of it. It migrated into Rome, and Stoicism sort of grew from being a rebellious, countercultural philosophy that was in many ways like moving through the populations of the Roman slave population and lower classes, and then became the philosophy of emperors. The most famous is, of course, Marcus Aurelius, who wrote the book Meditations, or the diary that then became a book. And then it very much migrated into being a timeless text for a lot of leaders throughout American history. It sat by the bedside of the American founders. It guided Teddy Roosevelt when he went through the Amazon. So Stoicism has this long tradition to it of being a philosophy of focus and working on your self-control. Geeky Stoics that I helm is really about how Stoicism is embedded in our culture in so many ways that are invisible to us. I think I pretty much learned it from Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings and a couple works of say, C.S. Lewis. These texts reflect Stoicism's basic principles in many ways. And so it's already around us. And so Geeky Stoics, we make content helping people understand the different Stoic ideas through their favorite stories.
Oh, so when you say people, are you talking about young people, old people, all people? I mean, who looks at these things?
Well, my YouTube metrics do tell me that 90% of the audience is men between age 20 and 40. So I would say it is predominantly young men who are looking for these kind of things and trying to understand their place in the world and maybe why they feel discontent, out of control, and looking for some kind of well of purpose. Stoicism has become very popular and trendy in some ways that are good, in some ways that are bad. At the same time that faith, spirituality, and church attendance have both gone up at the same time, this sort of secular tradition and this, of course, religious tradition are both rising, which tells me that people feel adrift and they are looking for an anchor in the storm.
Good. Well, sounds like you got an anchor, and here's another anchor over here, I suspect. Now, Daniel, a lot of people know who Ayn Rand was. Some of those people, mostly everybody who knows who Ayn Rand was, knows about Objectivism. That was the name of her philosophy. You run something called the Prometheus Foundation. So before you tell us exactly about Objectivism, tell us first of all, who the heck was Prometheus and what the Prometheus Foundation does?
Yes, well, Prometheus is from Greek mythology. He was a titan, a bit of a trickster. He liked to play, I guess, the old-time equivalent of pranks on the gods. And to defy Zeus, who he particularly had a bit of a problem with, he stole fire from Mount Olympus and he brought it down to mankind. and gave them this fire, which also ended up in technology and advancement and knowledge. So made humankind much better off, which really angered Zeus, and so Zeus punished him for all of eternity. So the Prometheus Foundation is a nonprofit that is a grant-making nonprofit that looks for enterprising individuals or organizations who want to bring a new type of fire to mankind, an intellectual fire in the form of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. And we fund different programs, different events, conferences, book projects, etc., for anyone who thinks they have a really good idea for bringing her ideas to a wider audience.
Okay, there's, again, the people who know who Ayn Rand was, and then probably most people don't. She died several years ago, but as I recall, she was born in Russia about 1905, had a different name before she came here. So give us just briefly her history and sort of who she was so we can understand the kind of impact she made through the novels that she wrote.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Ayn Rand was born Alyssa Rosenbaum, and she was born in Russia during a great transitional period. And she saw the sort of the rise of communism there and saw its destructive nature on her family and on her neighbors. And so when she could, she wanted to leave as quickly as possible. And she came to the United States. And interestingly enough, she settled in Hollywood. And she wanted to be a screenwriter. So she took any job she could in studios, including in the wardrobe department. And you can see her as an extra, in fact, in some very old movies. So she started writing, started getting some interest in her writing, actually started doing a lot of plays, and developed some plays that were really revolutionary at the time and that brought her early success. And then she started writing novels. She started formulating her ideas based on her experiences and what she was observing about the world, but she wanted to tell them through story. And so she started writing a lot of novels, including We the Living, and then Anthem. But of course, her most famous novels were The Fountainhead and then later Atlas Shrugged, published in 1957, which has sold millions of copies and inspired so many people around the world.
Well, it continues to sell a lot. And it's interesting that you mentioned the fact that she was getting her philosophy out through stories, and you were talking about stories, Stephen, in terms of your geeky things and stories. And so I think that person watching knows that the reason why so many people watch visual things is not just because they want a bunch of us intellectuals sitting around talking about these high-powered geek Roman and Greek ideas, but they want to know how it relates to their real life. And so give us now, I mean, here's a person who's basically a novelist. What the heck does she have to do with philosophy, for goodness sake? Because a lot of people who know objectivism just say, she didn't have a PhD in philosophy or whatever. What would you say about that, Daniel?
So when Ayn Rand was formulating her ideas, she was in what she considered to be the most moral country in human history. It was a country that presented so much opportunity for people, for advancement, for thriving, for human flourishing, and she was really looking at why. Why here? And she came to this conclusion that it's because America was not a country that was founded because of conquest or stealing of things, but it was a country that was formed on ideas. And it was the ideas of the US that made it such a remarkable achievement in the history of mankind. At the same time, she was seeing a rise in the United States of people who did not appreciate this and who did not understand it, and who in fact were adopting the very ideas she had fled in communist Russia. And she said, how is this? Why are people adopting these ideas? And how can we defend the right, true, proper ideas? She was disillusioned by sort of both political parties because they weren't doing it, at least not properly. They were selling out in so many ways. And so she started writing these novels and developing her philosophy. And what she really wanted, what you noted, was she wanted a philosophy for living on Earth. And that is ultimately what she called objectivism, a philosophy for living on Earth. Something that is not a heady mind game played by professors in some university. It wasn't a trick of language. It was a real set of ideas that you could put into practice in your life to live a flourishing life and also defend your ideas against these attacks.
And this is something that we very much have in common, in the Stoic tradition. I don't have the lines on the top of my head, but in Seneca's letters, Seneca, who was an advisor to Emperor Nero, infamously, he wrote very much about bewaring the philosophers on the streets of Rome who play word games or try to question the meaning of words and basically just get you caught in rhetorical traps. That those people were not philosophers, because the actual idea of philosophy is to come up with rules for life, ways in which you can exist in the real world as you are. And you mentioned stories and kind of the ways that the Geeky Stoics idea comes into it. For me, one of the most Stoic principles is that change is inevitable. And I think this is something that very much runs through the libertarian tradition as well. Spontaneous order, things will always be changing. I learned that first when I was a kid watching Star Wars Episode 1, when Anakin Skywalker, the boy who would become Darth Vader, says he doesn't want things to change, and his mother says to him, "But you can't stop the change any more than you can stop the suns from setting." I was 13 years old, and I remembered that. And I didn't have to have someone wave a philosophy book at me and go, "Marcus Aurelius of Rome said change is nature's delight," because nobody cares. Nobody cares about that. But the story of Darth Vader, that's mythology at this point in the United States of America, as is when Frodo in The Lord of the Rings says to Gandalf, "I wish none of this had ever happened. I wish the ring had never come to me." And Tolkien responds through Gandalf and says, "So do all who wish, or so do all who live to see such times." And he goes on to say something that we basically only have the choice in how we respond to being given the ring or the burden that we never wanted. And that's real life right there.
Well, that gets to this issue of control. You mentioned earlier that there are a lot of things in life that we cannot control, but that from a Stoic standpoint, it's all focused on how we react to it. And I think a lot of people, without knowing that that's a Stoic principle, would say to people, that bad things could happen to you, but how you react to it is the important thing. The thing I think it ties maybe both of these together is the idea of reason. So give us in your mind how important reason is, and how do you use reason to get to live this kind of a life that you're trying to live in spite of obstacles that happen that you can't control?
That's a good question. I would say that on the element of control, there are some objectivists who do feel that Stoicism is defeatist, that it basically sort of asks you to sit back and take whatever's coming to you. Some people have suggested that it's like asking you to wear your leash and just be kind of dragged along by life. And I think the area where this gets into trouble is that there are things that we feel are out of our control, but they actually are. And so some of these things might be government and policies. And we go, there's war happening in the world. I have no control over that. Or Washington, D.C. is chaos. There's nothing I can do about that. But you can. You can actually do things about that as a citizen. You can be involved in your country. You can get involved in your community. And so the disagreements usually come from how realistic are you being about what you can affect in life. I'd love to hear kind of what Daniel has to say about the reason element here and where that comes in.
So Objectivism says that we're all individuals. We have individual minds, and we have to act individually. No one can think for you. Even if you get ideas from people, you'll still have to take action on those ideas. You personally have to take action on those ideas. And so what is good then for an individual to live a flourishing life is for them to be as free as possible, to use their mind to create the type of life that is going to make them happy. In fact, Objectivism says your individual life is your highest moral purpose. And so the point is, you use reason because that is your one and only mechanism for understanding the world. You have your mind, you have your consciousness, you have your free will. And although many things may be outside of your control, Objectivism would argue that the vast majority of things, and especially the most important things, are within your control, and that you get to make those choices on a daily basis. Who you go out on dates with, ultimately who you marry, what career you're going to have, if you're going to have children or not, the food you're going to consume. All these things that we make choices on a daily basis are within our control, and that you should not only focus your mind to control those things, but also understand that those are going to ultimately be the things that make you happy. And so be joyous in those choices. Really flourish in the ability to choose those things in your life.
Well, you talked a lot about joy and flourishing and all that, and somehow when I think of Stoicism, I think of Am I wrong about that or not?
I mean, Stoic in the dictionary is certainly looked at that way. You know, you are relatively stern, you're reserved in your emotions. But you know, the tradition of Stoicism is a little bit more rich than that. There's certainly no evidence that Stoics, from again Marcus Aurelius to Cleanthes to Zeno, that they didn't encounter incredible challenges and weep and cry about those things, feel emotion. There's just sort of this element that you're supposed to distrust and question your emotions. There's a saying, I believe it comes from Epictetus, who was a Roman slave and a very famous Stoic as well, that said that we must check our emotions like a shopkeeper would check coins in the market. So a market keeper would know whether or not a coin was counterfeit just by feeling it. And that, I believe, very true to the issue of emotions. You know, just because you're feeling angry doesn't mean that anger is actually what's knocking on your door in your mind. It actually might be grief. You know, it might be sadness in disguise. Sometimes the emotions that we feel are not exactly what they present themselves to be. You need to take a moment to think about that, to reflect on it. And so I would just say the Stoic is slower to react on those things, and they take that extra time, because if your emotions are in the driver's seat of your body and your mind, you're going to get yourself into all kinds of trouble and make mistakes that sometimes cannot be reversed.
So the objectivist framing of that, because we also don't, in objectivism, don't say that your emotions should drive you in any way, but the framing that we have is that emotions are your automatic response to your judgments about the world, to what you've declared that you think about certain things. And so emotions don't give you new information about the world, like they don't tell you anything about reality, but they do tell you a lot about yourself and how you respond to things. And I think maybe both philosophies, objectivism has certainly been described as emotionless and cold, but to me it is a philosophy that actually celebrates emotion, but in a very particular way, which is, yes, you should experience great joy when you do things that make you happy, and you should feel deep sadness when values are taken away from you. But ultimately you have to use your reasoning mind to discover what those values are and to act on them.
Well, and you talk about emotions. I had the opportunity years ago to interview Nathaniel Branden. I'm not going to go through who Nathaniel Branden was, except he was very important to Ayn Rand for a long time, and then, shall we say, not so important after a while. But one of the things that he said to me about Ayn Rand, obviously he's very complimentary in many ways, but he said she was the only person he ever met who had zero compassion. And so this comes to this idea of emotions, and Ayn Rand sort of says, you know, emotions come because of what happens to your reason, but they're not things. Emotions are not tools of cognition. Is that the way she said it? So what does that mean exactly?
That essentially means that if I feel angry about something, that doesn't give me any information about the nature of the thing. It just tells me how I feel about it. It doesn't give me new information. If I feel anger at watching a Geeky Stoic video, which I would never, because they're fantastic, but it doesn't actually give me I'm not learning anything new about the video itself. I'm only learning something about myself and my response. And I can introspect and think, well, what is causing this anger? And is it rational? Like, is it something that is appropriate to be feeling or not? But what she's saying is, emotions don't tell you anything about the world itself, right? And part of this is because objectivism is a philosophy that says your mind inside does not create the world outside. You have to accept the world outside of you. You have to accept the facts of reality. You have to accept the facts of who you are and your life, the things you can't change. And then you go out and do things that change the world. But your mind, your consciousness, doesn't change the world.
Yeah. So, Stephen, with your geeky Stoicism and stories, I mean, the stories, give us an example or two, if you will. But the stories have got to be filled with emotion. You can't just, it can't be your rational mind all the time. Am I right or no?
I think that's absolutely true. So my first book that I wrote is called How the Force Can Fix the World. And that book is narrowly focused, again, on George Lucas's Star Wars. And so anger is a big factor in those stories. And I think Probably one of our most popular videos at Geeky Stoics is about the writings of the Stoic philosopher Seneca as it pertains to anger. He has a great collection which is called On Anger. And we tied those things together with the fall of Anakin Skywalker and the temptation of Luke Skywalker in the famous Star Wars story. How anger moves through us and has the ability to destroy civilizations when it is left untamed. So there's just an element there that I would say that great stories always contain great emotion. But I've not really heard many stories where we look back favorably or positively on heroes who get overrun by their emotions and just let things run wild. They have to get their arms around them. They have to figure out a way to relate to and direct those emotions toward a good. And I think the Stoics do have an inherent notion that goods exist. Now, one area where we disagree is that Stoics are very focused on the goods of the whole. There's this thing, they're always saying what's good for the hive is good for the bee. They talk often about how the individual is like the hand or the fingers on a greater body. So we are all part of one global community, one whole. And so I think there's a skepticism there that, again, like a Soviet communist might go, well, if one hand is infected, we might just cut it off, meaning like the individual doesn't matter too much. So Stoics are collectivists by nature, and that's something that is inherent in their philosophy. They believe that there is a higher good, and I am skeptical that such a thing exists, that common good is always the way.
Well, I would say Ayn Rand would roll over in her grave if she heard that, Daniel. Why? Because the way she looks at individuals versus society is what?
Yes, so for Ayn Rand, everything starts with the individual and the individual's values and how they want to be in the world. And she says things like, for instance, charity, which many people see as a virtue, she doesn't see it as a virtue or a vice. She sees it as basically neutral, and it depends on each individual's values and their position in the world. If someone is destitute and they have a few dollars left in their pocket and they can barely afford food, is it actually virtuous for them to give to charity? In that scenario, she would say no, it would actually harm themselves to do so. But at the same time, if a billionaire wants to give to charity, he's not morally obligated to. It's just, what is his value hierarchy? Is there a charity in the world that is doing something that is bringing about a world that he or she wants to see? Then he should consider it. But the point is, it's not bad to interact with people. It's not bad to form groups and cooperate according to Objectivism. In fact, it can be an immense good. Ayn Rand was a capitalist and believed in free trade. Her point is, we shouldn't be forced to engage in these things, and we certainly shouldn't feel moral obligation to do so if it contradicts something that we believe, something that we're trying to pursue.
Well, she's very strong on something she called rational self-interest. And we get to the word selfishness, and then we talk about rational self-interest. What's the difference?
I don't think there's actually much of a difference in reality. There certainly is a difference in the way that we commonly use the words. Selfish has become such a pejorative in our culture, meaning someone who will trample over other people to sort of get what they want. But Ayn Rand was very clear that that is not what she meant. She very much, selfish for her meant taking an interest in yourself, being interested in yourself first so that you can go out in the world and pursue your values. But in all of her books and all of her writing, she made it clear that it is actually not selfish to take advantage of people. It is not selfish to lie. It is not selfish to defraud people. All those things either harm you because you could get caught and go to prison, or even more so, they harm you because they destroy your self-esteem. They destroy your own consciousness. One of the crazy stories from several years back, people will remember, was the Bernie Madoff story, right? And he's often pointed to as this example of, look, he was being selfish. He was stealing and getting away with it for a long time, and only because he got caught was there any punishment. But then his journals were revealed. And what's really interesting is that he was insanely tortured by what he was doing. He was having panic attacks. He was living an absolutely miserable life when he was lying to people. I wouldn't call that selfish.
Yeah.
I would call that self-destructive.
And both Christians and Stoics kind of share this general idea that comes from the Greek word eudaimonia, which is basically that you and your happiness are tied basically to this higher power, right? That this idea that you can't be happy unless you're doing what's within your nature. And what is within your nature? maybe biologically or handed down to you by God, the creator, the logos. You need to be in line with that in order to live a good and happy life. And deceiving others, defrauding others, being at odds with the entire community, you're going to be tortured. Like, you're not going to feel good. And I think that is our shared belief in what humans are made for. We're made for cooperation. And that's what both philosophies very much believe. We are made to cooperate. Just nobody should make you cooperate. You have to want to do that.
Well, and just in the few minutes that we have left, for that viewer who is sitting there going, "Oh my God, I can identify with some of this. Some of it's a little bit up here." What would you say to that person that, from a Stoic's point of view, would give them additional insight or perspectives on their own life?
Well, you got to keep it simple. Stoicism is, I believe, a set of tools that you can use to address problems in your life. Maybe you're dealing with anger issues. Maybe you are dealing with
By the
grief.
way, we don't have anybody in Washington, D.C. who's dealing with anger issues, do we?
No, not at all.
Okay, just
everybody's
checking.
very
Wanna make
happy.
Sure. Okay, yes, right. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, but it's a toolkit. I was writing yesterday after your panel on Objectivism and Stoicism, like, what is happiness for and what is Stoicism helpful for? I believe that Stoicism is a toolkit of philosophy that helps you clear the runway of debris so that happiness can actually find a landing. I don't think Stoicism will make you happy. It removes the things that are in the way, stopping you from enjoying the best of your life, your fear, your anger, your self-loathing, other kind of issues that might plague any individual human. It helps you find out what those things are, get a little bit of a handle on them.
And what would you say to that person, Daniel?
Objectivism says you have this one life to live, and that you should make the most of this one life by pursuing what actually makes you happy, by identifying, using your mind, the things that are of a value to you, and then by actually acting to achieve those values. Because you should be designing your life with intention and purpose every single day that you get to live on this beautiful earth.
Well, I thank both of you. I know that viewer thanks you so much. And, well, I doubt that we've converted you into a career of philosophy. Our hope is that we provided you with new and useful perspectives so that you can live an even better life going forward. So join us on your favorite social media platform for other important topics, because, as always, we've been talking about things that matter with people who care.